One, two. going to be really forceful and start talking. If people could grab their coffees, take seats, thank you very much. We will get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Matt Whitaker, I'm Chief Exec at Pro Bono Economics, and you're all very welcome here this morning to join our event on Conservatives and Civil Society, where over the next hour or so, we will get into the conversation around what does the relationship look like between civil society and the Conservative Party in a narrow sense, and the Conservative movement in a wider sense. To help us with that, we've joined by some leading Conservative politicians, leading Conservative thinkers, and by some excellent civil society experts, practitioners, leaders, so that we can have a really fulsome and open, I hope, conversation around what the relationship looks like now and what it looks like in the future, what it could and should be. That is true of all the people we'll have on the stage. It's true of the audience too. We've got a really good bunch in here today and indeed online with us. So I do want today to be a conversation, which means you can join in. That's one of the reasons why we've got some tasty looking pastries at the back. Because once we're done today, we are hoping that people will stick around, have another croissant, have a coffee and have a chat, so that we can make sure that whatever we just start discussing today up here, we continue to discuss out there. You can also get involved by asking some questions. We've got a QR code on the screen. Do click on that, follow the instructions, post your questions. They will get flashed up on the screen, and over the course of the morning, we will try and ask as many of those as we possibly can. And if you're the sort of person that prefers screaming into the void of social media, then do just tag us at hashtag PBE events, and we will join you there. Now, in many ways, today's event is the final part of a trilogy of events that we've been running at PBE over the last 14 months or so. So back in January 24, we hosted Labour Party and civil society to bring together those two sides to discuss what their relationship looked like. And what we heard from Keir Starmer and from his team was a pledge to reset that relationship. It's fair to say that is a conversation that was very actively engaged in on the day and continues today, not without bumps in the road, but nevertheless a good conversation to start. Part two then came towards the end of last year when we brought together civil society and senior civil servants to swap notes, to get to know each other a bit better, to build some relationships, and ultimately to coalesce around a shared ambition to work more closely together to tackle some of the challenges facing the country. So this is part three. We don't quite know where it's going to take us just yet. I am confident, though, that unlike the third installment of The Godfather, it will be time well spent. And I hope that we all leave the room today feeling inspired and ready to continue the conversation that we have started. And like all good trilogies, we like an origin story. And like all good leaders of think tanks, I like a strained metaphor. So indulge me on this. This whole set of events goes back really to the Law Family Commission on Civil Society, which we ran between 2020 and 2023. And the launch event in January 2023 in particular, which we set out a whole bunch of recommendations and had as one of our main conclusions the idea that civil society should, indeed must be, more closely connected into policy making. The insight that civil society brings is unique and incredibly valuable, but too often overlooked in policy discussions. So we wanted to elevate and plug in civil society into those policy-making discussions in whatever form. And the events we've been running over the last year or so have really been our contribution towards that effort. So that's the trilogy. Like all good final parts, we're giving the audience what it wants, which is some cameos from some of the original cast members. And I'm very delighted to say that much like Dan Aykroyd and Bill Murray making their successful returns to the Ghostbuster franchise in the last year or two, we are joined today by Stuart Andrew, who was one of the stars of the show back in 2023, and now as Shadow Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, is the perfect person to kick things off this morning. So please welcome Stuart to the stage.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me here today. I don't think I've ever quite had an introduction like that before, but there you go. Look, first of all, I want to say this is a very different world for me from how the last time I came to speak to you. I had officials following me with the speech that they had written, the policymakers had written, media people were all there, and then you become the shadow Secretary of State, and you literally are on your own. And I've literally been writing notes myself this moment ago. But look, I think this is really timely and a really helpful discussion, and one that I'm delighted that you are having, because we as a party, of course, are thinking about what happened at the last election, but also thinking about the future and where we go forward in terms of our future policy development. And I think we need to start off by being honest. Let's be honest about the relationship that sometimes exists between the civil society and the Conservative Party. Sometimes it was good, but sometimes it was strained. And if I'm really honest and think about my own reflections of my time as the Minister for Civil Society, there frankly wasn't enough of that engagement with the sector. And that is one of the things that I have taken away with me as a massive learning curve, if you like, from my time in DCMS. And, you know, sometimes there are really challenging conversations that have to be had between the sector and between government, but those conversations are incredibly important. And whilst sometimes we might not be able to agree or act in the way that the sector may want, just understanding where the sector is actually does help you to think about wider policy and how you might be able to change. Now, I'm really keen. Now, as long as I am the Shadow Secretary of State, and given my party, we could be changing that goodness knows when. But anyway, as long as I am the Secretary of State, the Shadow Secretary of State, I want to make sure that we have regular engagement with you. And I mean that most sincerely, because, and why do I say that? Because the sector makes a massive contribution to the UK. Through all of the fundraising that's done, the billions of pounds that are raised each year, the enormous range of services that are provided that help us in our society, whether that be people in hospices, or whether that be looking after young people, whether that looking after older people, looking after animals, whatever it is, there is a huge contribution the sector makes to our country. And those services, if they were not there, the cost to the Treasury and the taxpayer would be frankly enormous. And so it is right that we have that proper conversation. And I also say it because the third sector, the charity sector, the civil society world is in my soul. Many of you will know that I started my career in the charity sector, primarily working in hospices and children's hospices as a head of fundraising. And I saw the enormous contribution that those hospices and the people who worked in them gave to those families who needed them at probably some of the most challenging times that that family would ever face. And so seeing the dedication of the staff that work for the charities, but also the massive contribution that volunteers made, has stayed with me and is something that I feel very passionate about, and something that I want to ensure we think about more. Now, engagement, as I said before, we did it, but it wasn't enough. But where we did engage, I hope that we did try to respond in as much a positive way as we possibly could. So at the time when all the energy prices were going up, we heard loud and clear from the sector that this was becoming a major issue, particularly for the small and medium-sized charities. And that is why I took the time to try and persuade the then Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, that we really needed to help the sector. I have to say, I was asked to go to a dinner. It cost me £35. But it was the best £35 I ever spent, because Jeremy Hunt was sat right next to me. And I bent his ear for the entire evening. I'm glad to say that they gave that £100 million that provided help and support for energy costs at the time, but also provided grants to organisations so that they can modernise all of the energy systems they have in their properties, so that hopefully it will put them on a more sustainable footing in the future. But as I say, we've got to go further, and we are starting that. As Louis will mention, I'm sure, we are about to hold, as we are already holding, a series of roundtables with each of the varying sectors, and we're very keen to have one with the civil society sector. We want to hear directly, what are the questions that we as a party should be thinking about? What are the policies that we need to be developing? What are the things that can help you to continue to do your work, but hopefully in a much easier way? And what are the big issues that you face? And I know that some of those will be the same as when I was a minister, things like the endless complications around public sector contracts and the costs that those put on. Having honest conversations about regulation, you know, is it too onerous, or are there ways that we can modernize and change that? And grant applications that sometimes feel like organizations spend their life just constantly applying for annual grants that don't enable organizations to think more long term. Now, I can't say here and now that we will say yes to all of those, but what I do want to know is, you know, what you think are those big issues. And that is why today is really important, because that will help us then think about that policy formation that we are doing. But it is also our job as the opposition to hold the government to account when we need to be. And I have said to Lisa Nandy that, look, I want to be a constructive opposition, not just attack all the time, but actually raise issues that you raise with me so that she can hear it from all directions, but also to hold to account where we think there are serious mistakes being made. And we're doing that at the moment on the issue around the national insurance contributions, because we know that that is a major cause of concern for so many charities up and down the country. Estimates suggest that £1.4 billion cost on the sector, and that is an enormous amount of money. When I think of organisations like Marie Curie, for example, who say it's going to be close to £3 million for them, having been a fundraiser myself, I know that I'd need at least 2 or 3 years to plan to increase the budget by £3 million. I can't just do it overnight. And so we will continue to make that point in Parliament and make sure that your voice is heard. But any other issues that you have, that you feel that we need to be highlighting, that we need to be pressing in Parliament, please do come and let either Louis or myself know, because I want this to be a much better relationship than we've had before. I want it to be honest. I want it to be frank. And the only way to do that is by us ensuring that our door is constantly open. And I give you that commitment that that will be the case for me. And that round table, I hope, will be the start of what will be an ongoing conversation with you over the years to come as we think about the future. Thank you.
Stuart, thank you. That's really encouraging to hear. Some really great messages there, and the perfect way to start this morning, I think, both in terms of the message you're delivering, but actually also you've set up all of the questions that I've got for the panelists absolutely perfectly. So thank you for that. I know you have to disappear at some point during the morning, so thank you now for your contribution, and hope you enjoy what you do get to see. Now, to reflect on Stuart's thoughts and to think more generally about this question around Conservatives and civil society, we are blessed with an illustrious panel. Their names are up there. I'd like you to welcome them up on the stage, and we'll get into some conversation. There we go. Forget about the boss. Great. Look, we've got a fantastic panel. We've only got, 45 minutes. Keep your questions coming in. We'll get through as many of those as possible. I will run through introductory questions for each panelist, which they will speak to. But to give you a quick introduction, we have, who do we have? We have Hannah Pearce, who's Director of Campaigns, Policy and Research at the Royal British Legion. Ruth Hollis, who's Chief Exec at Spirit of 2012. Jiro Oye, who's another OG from 2023 event, I have to say. Chief Exec and founder of 2020 Levels. We have Louis French, who is the MP for Old Bexley and Sidcup and Shadow Minister for Sport, Gambling and Civil Society. And finally, Seb Payne, who's lead writer and columnist for The Times and formerly director of Onward, which is the think tank which has done so much for bringing forward thinking on the centre-right. So a fantastic set of panellists. We're going to jump into some questions. And as I say, Stuart set it up brilliantly for us. And Ruth, I'm going to turn to you first. Stuart talked about the fact that the last Conservative administration had a relationship with civil society that was sometimes good, but sometimes strained. And that may be a Conservative thing. I think it's just as likely it's a government thing. We know that with the current government, we're streeting talking about breaking the culture of charities lobbying government. So now that the Conservative Party is in opposition, there is that chance for some sort of rebalancing. How do you think both sides can strike a balance between helpfully collaborating but holding each other to account and challenge?
Not speak for charities that lobby on campaign and even something and I don't think what you're saying. I think Stuart's comments were very welcome. Not working. Thank you. Stop quickly. Very welcome about a constructive dialogue, recognizing that the relationship wasn't always where it could be, and that we need to, as a sector, with the opposition, all of the oppositions, work on that relationship. Is this working there? Can I? So I think that was great to hear. I would make 3 points really. I think the first is there's fantastic work being done by NCVO and Akivo around the covenant, the civil society covenant. They're working with government. That needs to be a cross-party endeavour. It's all about building relationships, building understanding, listening, and listening in the long term. Civil society often gets buffeted with changes of administration, changes of policy. And I think, if we can smooth that out and have a covenant that works cross-sector for the long time, that would be a really great step forward and help with some of that listening. It's great to hear the Chief Executive of the Charity Commission be really clear about lobbying and where charities can lobby, and that needs to be backed up with some rigour on both sides when there's issues around lobbying. And the final thing I would say is I think there is an opportunity, the government's programme is very big, very diverse. There are issues that we are all thinking about that matter to people that aren't getting cut through and won't necessarily get saliency against the backdrop of what the government's trying to deliver. I think the opposition holding some of those points, giving visibility to them, maintaining the saliency of some of those issues is really important, and building on what you did in government with some of the brilliant work around the What Work centres, thinking around well-being, loneliness, all of those issues we know matter, holding that centrally as we develop those relationships.
I think it's obviously really unhelpful when a politician of any colour criticises a charity for campaigning, and I think it would be helpful if all politicians recognise charities' right to undertake political campaigning. We are bound by rules, CC9, we're bound by a regulator, and the regulator will tell us when we step over the mark. But I think that there have been some unhelpful and kind of critical approaches from the Conservative Party against the charity's fundamental right to campaign, which hasn't been helpful. I would say that in my 20-odd years of working in a range of public affairs and campaigning jobs in charities, the two approaches that I've taken are, one, to always work cross-party. You can't align yourself with a particular party, but also to be a critical friend. So to criticise policy where you need to, but do that from a position of respect. And I think some of the antagonism between the charity sector and the Conservative Party is because those relationships don't exist in the first place. It's much easier to criticise when you're in an established relationship of trust and understanding. And I think where the Conservative Party get fed up with charities is where all they hear is the headline and the criticism. And that's not great for anyone.
Thanks, Anna. That's great. And probably a really good segue. I can hear Seb nodding along. And, Seb, you've done a lot of thinking on sort of intellectual underpinning of conservatism in the Conservative Party. As Stuart's already touched on, period now in opposition, that means reflection, it means renewal of policy agendas. In doing that, what do you think the role is for civil society to plug itself into those conversations that the party's having?
Well, I was it's quite loud. I was just thinking about the sort of title of this event. I think it is actually worth reflecting on going back to 2010 when the party did its last big intellectual renewal process in the run-up to that election where David Cameron was leader, and a lot of things were reconsidered about the Conservative Party's intellectual underpinning, but also its relationship with different parts of society that had changed hugely since the party had last been in power. And a lot of that was summed up by, obviously, the infamous big society, and I'd probably remain the last great stalwart of believing in the big society as a concept, which became tarnished incredibly quickly, that it was an idea about trying to move the conversation beyond what just the state can do, but how it interacts with different parts of British society. Instead, it was just seen as an excuse for cutting back public spending, essentially. And that was unfortunate, that the big society was an idea that was kind of generated before the financial crash, when David Cameron and George Osborne were facing a different financial era. And then when they came in, it sort of got pushed aside pretty rapidly and was forgotten. And I think, going back to the point you were just saying, that's partly why I think some of that distrust and antagonism began, because that was never kind of fully resolved. Now, in terms of where the Conservative Party is at now in its thinking, I mean, it is facing a similarly dire economic situation that it's working within. In fact, if not anything, it's worse than it was in the run-up to the 2010 election. So it is more important than ever to have a good and strong relationship with all parts of society that can help tackle those big challenges. But at the same time, the Conservative Party is going to have to be honest about prioritizing about where it can do stuff and where money can and can't be spent. And, you know, the fact is, it's incumbent on both sides to have a relationship that, you know, it does have that respect and trust that I think was lost pretty quickly after 2010 because of the way the state was changing, because of where the cutbacks were. But ultimately, if it does want to renew, if it does want to build a broad relationship across society where people are actually going to vote for it across different groups, then it is going to have to begin with civic society. It is going to have to begin with that kind of sector, which I just think there hasn't been enough done on. So it is an important thing. The danger, of course, again, is that much like in 2010, it will end up getting squeezed when you get to the kind of hard stuff of where spending is going to be, where the governments are going to have to prioritize. And that's where Stuart and Louis come in about trying to fight that case and trying to make sure that it does get a good hearing within the party. And I think across the wider centre-right movement, not just the way we did that Onward, but other think tanks as well, there is an acknowledgement that has to play a big role in the party's renewal. It's just where that looks like. And if there is a kind of constructive dialogue from both sides, I think there can be on the political side, and hopefully sort of opposition makes things a bit easier. You can move away from some of the decisions made within power, and there's more opportunity to sort of, you know, start afresh, which I think is probably what you do need.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That's really comprehensive. I was thinking of questions as you were going, and then you kept ticking them off with the next comment.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
Exactly. Thinking ahead.
What you did touch on there was the sort of the fiscal constraints, the financial constraints, which obviously this government is facing, but in opposition, the Conservatives will also have to be realistic about. And Hannah, you've already touched on it, but this point about the sort of lack of money out there. That's true within government. It's also very, very true within the charity sector, clearly. Tight funding environment right now. So what role do you think civil society and Conservatives together can play to divert more resource into charities and into social sector?
Well, we might come on to more into the funding point. I'm going to talk a bit more about how we can work together. And I think that there are formal and informal ways that the sector can work better with the Conservative Party. So in the past, well, the Labour Party and the Lib Dems have regular policy development processes that are open to charities to make submissions and ideas. You can then follow up with those submissions and ideas with phone calls, relationships in and out of government. That doesn't happen with the Conservative Party. So if you're a charity that doesn't have any formal or informal links to the Conservative Party, it can feel really impenetrable. There aren't any ways in. And then on Tuesday, Kemi has announced this new policy renewal process, which is great, because I think that's entirely the right kind of platform that gives charities the opportunity to say, okay, the Conservative parties are looking for ideas about social welfare or employment. Where can we make that contribution? Where can we kind of put our ideas forward and then follow up with developing relationships? So that's really, I think, great news for the sector, that announcement on Tuesday, and we look forward to more details about that. The other way of, in my experience, of engaging with the Conservative Party, because you don't have those informal links like you do with the Labour Party. So there's a lot of overlap between the charity sector and civil society on the Labour side, who then go into politics. So, for example, I used to be in rooms regularly when I worked for Children and Young People's Family with Lisa Nandy, who now is Louis' counterpart culture secretary. So those informal relationships are existing a lot of the time with the Labour Party in the charity sector. That doesn't happen so much with the Conservatives. So in my experience, I have tried to find those relationships. So in 2018, I think it was, when Nusrat Ghani became Transport Minister, I looked at her biography and found out that she used to work for Age Concern. And at that point, I was working for Age UK. So I think that that link meant that we got a meeting with her very quickly. She was really sympathetic, and she became a really good ally to us on the work that we were doing to improve patient transport. In 2016, when I was working with Jo Cox to set up the Commission on Loneliness, she cleverly realised that that project would be more successful if it was jointly Conservative and Labour-led, because loneliness isn't a party political issue. She brought Seema Kennedy on board, who was an incredible advocate for us and helped once after Jo was murdered. Seema helped me bring Rachel Reeves onto the commission to be the Labour chair of that project. And then fortuitously, Seema became Theresa May's PPS, which I think was part of the reason why that project was such a success. We got a multi-million-pound fund for loneliness projects, and we got the first Minister for Loneliness. And that was, much of that is down to the relationship with Seema and her relationship with Theresa May. So I think that for me, in my experience, because of the lack of formal ways of engaging with the Conservative Party, I've had great success with informal relationships, but that's kind of not good enough, because that's a bit down to luck. And so if the Conservative Party can provide more formal opportunities for the sector to engage with them, that's got to be a good thing.
And what about with the sort of the hinterland? So Seb's talking about the think tanks that are out there. Do you have engagement there? Is that a route in?
Definitely, and actually at Age UK, we had a great relationship with Conservative Home and Paul Goodman, and that was partly because we did fringe events with them at party conferences, but then we got to a good relationship, which meant we sometimes wrote pieces for Con Home. So yeah, different ways in.
Excellent, thanks. And Ruth, did you want to come back in on the funding?
I think, it's known as a fiscal environment is very difficult, particularly for local charities and at the local end. And I think, anything that we can jointly do, building this relationship to make sure that there is long-term stable funding routes, that we harness philanthropy, but also that public sector funding works well and works for the long time, could be incredibly valuable in building that relationship, but also generating sustainability and really supporting the work that charities are doing at the very, very local level. Thank you.
Juro, we've already touched on this, but this role that civil society plays as a critical friend and a challenger of government, in many ways is sort of the unofficial opposition. Obviously now Conservatives are the official opposition. How can the two work together to hold government to account?
I think we can approach it from two different angles. Charities, by nature of what we do, we're rooted in communities. We can gather deep insight and we can engage in terms of challenging situations and inform government policy impact. We provide real-time data, but most importantly, the lived experience that highlights policy gaps and areas needing urgent attention and reform. I believe in effective partnership working. I've jotted down 4 points in which I think we can actually work together effectively. The first one is charities can provide independent, evidence-based research, not just highlighting the problems that you mentioned earlier, but offering practical policy recommendations, things that can actually be put forward in Parliament. And an opposition can play their part in amplifying these insights in Parliament, using the debates, committees, and public platforms to push for change. Third point I'd say is both should engage in public media. That we need to engage the public media, raising awareness and mobilizing support for pressing issues. The opposition have the ability to be able to do that, but they also need to bring frontline charities, frontline community groups to be able to help amplify their messages also. And the fourth point is there needs to be a balance. Charities must maintain our independence and avoid becoming over-partisan and ensuring that advocacy remains grounded in facts and impact. If you're doing it and you're doing that well, we'll be able to work collaboratively to really drive for the change that we're hoping to see.
Brilliant, thank you. Louis, you've heard quite a lot from the panel. Encouraging stuff, I think, in terms of the appetite for working with the Conservative Party and the clear need for having that relationship. And as Stuart touched on in his opening speech, there's lots that the last administration can point back at and say, actually did a pretty good job around philanthropy, around the way in which worked with civil society through the pandemic and so on. Yes, there were tensions at times, and yes, the world is changing very rapidly. So what now, from your position, are you thinking that the Conservatives need to do in order to not necessarily reset, but rebuild and strengthen the relationship with civil society?
Good morning, everyone. And firstly, thank you for coming along. And I think the kind of size of the audience, I think, highlights the appetite for that relationship to significantly improve in the months and years ahead, whilst we're sadly in opposition. But I think some of the points that have been made already about the timeliness of this conversation with Kemi's big policy launch on Tuesday. We'd been tasked as shadow ministers and under Stuart's leadership in our team to start that engagement as early as possible. A lot of that focus has been, as Stuart highlighted, on kind of national insurance increase, which we're hearing across the whole piece is causing major concerns and issues financially, not just for the charity sector, but for all parts of the DCMS brief, whether that's sport, community groups, all the way up to big national institutions. So that has been a primary focus, and that's probably brought people together a lot earlier than we were necessarily prepared for. But that's the nature of being in opposition. You don't know what's coming next. So I think the relationships have started to heal if they needed to heal already. I think my personal experience of being an MP for around 3.5 years now, most of that relationships with charities has been in the right place. I have no problems with charities lobbying me or campaigning. That's what you're there to do for your cause. I think there are natural tensions with government, and I think the crowding out effect when you can't do everything you'd like to do, and there are capacity issues on how many meetings you can take, etc. But as Stuart has highlighted, I suspect my roundtables are going to get a lot bigger after it's been said publicly. But I suspect we will look now, as I'm sure you'll all huddle around me at the end and want to make sure we know who everyone's here is. We'll probably look to do that kind of thematically in each area, and we'll try and build on that. So the focus originally has been on some of the kind of youth elements of the charities, but we will certainly expand that out and look at doing thematics. My personal background, which I hope to bring to these kind of policy conversations, is one of a local councillor for 8 years before I become the MP. I proudly represent my home community, so I'm very much engaged with the local community aspects, the work and issues around commissioning, the prevention, which I think is the key part of a lot of the charitable work, and how do we unlock that? And then in my professional background, I used to head up kind of sustainable investing, so I did a lot of work around impact. So the Conservative Party does have a rich history around, unlocking gift aid all the way back in 1990. What are those kind of mechanisms we can do to unlock not just public sector monies for charities, but how do we unlock more private investments so we start to catch up with the models that we see in America to make sure that there's more donations coming forward? How do these big investors unlock their capital in a tax efficient way to actually drive some of this kind of work and funding that we need?
Great, thank you. And that's a really nice way to end, in that I have a follow-up question, which is around this idea of private sector money coming into the sector and philanthropy and what the Labour government is talking about with its impact economy. And I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with someone within Keir's team, in which they are keen to build their relationships with big philanthropists in the UK, including those who are not Labour donors, by which I mean Tory donors, in order to help think creatively about the sort of blended way in which you might tackle some of the challenges facing the country. Now, can we step outside partisan politics on that? Stuart's already touched on the fact that he wants to be a constructive opponent, and something like philanthropy, which was such a big topic for the last administration. Is this something where you can actually work with the current government on impact economy type ideas?
Stuart is absolutely right. Stuart has said from the start, we want to be constructive in opposition, and we are trying to do that. So obviously relationships we have behind the scenes to try and nudge and say, look, we think you're looking at this the wrong way. Have you considered this? There is a general issue, and without making a party political point too much, the feedback we're getting quite a lot is has been a lack of engagement in our side across sectors, and we're hearing that quite a lot. So we're having to try and present ideas in a way that is not just seen as us being opposition for the sake of being opposition. I think there's a couple of issues that I can see in this kind of private capital area for the Labour Party, and I think the idea, it's a cultural issue, I think, more than anything, in my experience investing in it, is that wealthy people wanting to do good is still a bad thing, and we see this quite a lot. And I think the American model, whilst very different culturally to us, actually allows that a lot easier to celebrate wealth and to celebrate people wanting to do good things with their wealth. So I think there are challenges that Keir and the Labour Party will have with that around just some of the structural issues and kind of philosophies. I think we're a lot more open to kind of market-based solutions to that. And it's something, like I said, that I worked on quite a lot with impact, particularly in the environmental space, but there are some very good social impact, whether it's impact bonds or other solutions that you can look at to actually drive that capital forward. So it's something, again, that I'm happy to lend expertise if it helps the government to kind of do that. But they have to be willing to have that kind of constructive relationship to actually allow for expertise to come forward.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm keen to open up to questions. Keen, actually, if we can, to maybe even wrap up a little bit early on stage so that we can have those actual one-to-one conversations that Louis is looking forward to very much. Can I see the questions, Becky? They up there? No? They're on the way, okay. So to save me turning around, I'm just going to stand over here so I can actually see them, then I can pose them as they come in. Are you going to? Okay, great. Just gave me a chance to stretch my legs. Okay, let's go with first question, which is, and probably this is one for you, Louis, in the first instance. Does the Conservative Party think that charities should be exempt from the increase in national insurance contributions to employers?
Well, I think we kind of proved that with a lot of our amendments yesterday in the House, and very disappointed, particularly on the hospices one, that there wasn't, Stuart's got a lot of expertise in this area, and it just seems, for me, it seems illogical that the government, again, without trying to make this two-party political, have not understood the impact on the NHS or other parts of the care sector from not exempting parts of the care system from this NHS national insurance increase. And I think it's just foolish. And I think they should have, the Lords, they should have listened to them Lords amendments, and that's why we had the votes yesterday.
Very good, thank you. Now, Stuart, you touched on the fact that what civil society does is makes a huge saving to Treasury, and it's part of what at PBE we do on a day-to-day basis is help charities just work out just how much of a saving they help the government to make. I'm looking over at charity colleagues. Do we think that's a sustainable model? Is that the right model? Should it be that that charities sort of play that role, or should more of that be taken into the state? Actually, should we have a bigger state?
I think we need to help charities be able to articulate the saving they do make. I'm not sure that should drive the agenda, and I think having a vibrant, independent, charitable sector working alongside the state is still incredibly valuable. So I wouldn't advocate the taking more in, I think, but that articulation of value, that articulation of impact, and coming back to what Louis was saying about philanthropic investment, being able to really articulate the value of what charities are doing is incredibly important in unlocking some of those discussions.
Just to add to that, I think, back to Louis' point in terms of bringing in private wealth and philanthropic funding into the space as well, it shouldn't solely just rely on charities being able to demonstrate the impact that they make. But if charities can work with government to demonstrate the impact that they're saving the state, then philanthropists can kind of come in and also help ease some of that burden from the state as well. There's nothing wrong with people that have money and want to do good, finding causes that they're passionate about that help grow civil society.
Great, thanks, Drew. Seb, I'm going to come to you on this one because you're a sort of tactician and you straddle lots of different things with your sort of journalistic approach and your think tank head. How do we collectively strengthen the voluntary sector so it rightfully claims its place at the table rather than being used as and when required by the powers that be? There is this sense, and we definitely, Labour were very explicit about this when we had the session with them last year, that they were leaning into that relationship with civil society out of self-interest because they knew that they were going to inherit a fiscal situation that was going to be tight. And so they wanted to pull on every possible lever they could. And whilst that means there is a seat at the table for civil society to some degree, it's hard not to feel a little bit used by it. How do we change that?
I think it's all about expertise is the key thing here, is that the thing that you find in civil society is the fact that you've got lots and lots of people who have a wide range of experience of society, of their communities, that goes way beyond anything that politicians or even businesses can kind of speak to. So the way to kind of tackle that is say that when the Conservative Party is looking at certain areas, and Labour Party as well, is that we have the real lived experiences of things that work, things that haven't worked, what people are saying, and using that to help inform policy making. Because I think the idea is, obviously these things can get transactional, as you alluded to, but by saying actually what it is about trying to make sure that we get to an approach where we're listening to each other and sort of where we're both coming from. And again, to what I was saying earlier, that was meant to be what the concept of the big society was about, was a more symbiotic relationship between civil society and politicians as well. Now, when it comes down to the hardcore policy making, that is always going to come under strain. But I think on the Conservative side, the fact that we've got these policy commissions and have got a quite lengthy process, I think does give the opportunity to engage with that in a more thorough way, because obviously, the next election's not, it's going to be, 2028, 2029. And Kemi Badenoch has said that she's not going to, set out hard policies for some time, which I think on balance is right, because we've kind of become used to this hyper speed of politics because of the chaos of the past couple of years. Whereas in fact, there is this kind of quite long leeway now, so particularly on the right of politics. I think MPs and people like Stuart need to use that time to kind of go back to first principles, go back to engaging with stakeholders, be it business, be it civil society, and figure out what those kind of principles are that will then go into whatever policy makes happen. So there is a kind of really unique opportunity on the right there. When it comes to Labour Party and the government, yeah, it's going to be tougher because they're in government and they're being pulled 50 different ways, and it's going to be hard to get that hearing. But I do think there was a golden opportunity to try and reset that on the right.
Great, and keep hold of that mic, because there was a great question which just popped up, which has disappeared from the moment, but I'm going to ask it anyway, which is the impact of reform. What impact is reform having on Tory social policy? And I suppose the sort of supplement to that is to say, what role can civil society play in helping the Conservative Party maintain its ground in the sort of centre-right rather than being pulled?
So obviously my general overall view on reform is that they're essentially a receptacle for people's anger at the moment, and not only the Conservative Party, but also the Labour Party as well. There are a lot of people looking towards reform because they don't, the so-called loveless majority the Labour has got, that they won out of anger at what happened in 14 years. And that's why they're still riding high, despite the kind of the war on the back of a taxi cab they seem to have had over the past couple of weeks. And I think that will continue for some time, and it will only be when voters' minds are focused on who do you want to be your next government that you may then see reform getting squeezed and support going back to the two main parties. But I think neither party can take them for granted, because the fact is they're speaking to an awful lot of people. There's a reason that they're polling 26% in the polls, because a lot of what they say charms a lot of people. Now, it may not be in kind of Westminster or traditional policy making circles, but if you go to, I'd strongly recommend, if you're interested, there was some focus groups on Channel 4 News last night done in Grimsby, and that is a kind of most potent example of why reform are doing so well at the moment, because of people just being completely fed up with the state of the country, the state of the economy, and the state of their communities. So I think when it comes to the Conservative Party, they need to make sure that, one of the things the party still does have is every Saturday morning, there's 10,000 volunteers who will be knocking on doors across the country to hear what voters have got to say. And that's only going to increase when it comes to local elections as well. Yes, there is something very important you can get from that. And that, of course, naturally leads to engaging with elements of civic society within the communities that they represent. Reform is not quite at that stage yet. I'm quite glad you didn't ask me how reform would engage with civic society, because I'm not sure they're quite there yet either, or they will be, because they exist as this kind of bucket of angst in a way. But I think, yes, the Conservative Party is, the party's not the size it once was, but it still has a wide membership across lots of different parts of society. And that is all about engaging with their communities. And MPs like Lou, who, represent the places they grew up and know their communities inside out, are absolutely vital to that.
Perfect, thank you. Do keep questions coming in, by the way. They'll keep appearing on the screen, as you do. Louis, one for you, which is, there is this sort of age-old issue that people within civil society can have, which is having really good engagement with DCMS or with the shadow DCMS team, but they're not cutting through to the department. So within the Conservative Party at the moment, how much influence are you able to spread across those other departments on some of those big social issues that we care about? Yeah,
that's a fantastic question. I think Stuart's referenced this before publicly, so apologies, Stuart, if I say there's something I should say. DCMS has often been referred to as the Department of Fun, but it's far from fun at the moment. And it should not be seen that way, because I think the various aspects of the DCMS department impact the lives of everybody around the country in different ways. So we certainly don't see it as Department of Fun, and actually we see it as something that runs through the kind of the veins of the whole of society, and it should be closely integrated with all aspects of government. There are obviously various challenges about cross-departmental working in government, which I think is no secret, regardless of who's in power. I think our challenge and what we do as a shadow team, we're working very, very closely, whether it be Kevin Hollyrake in kind of the local government side and looking at some of the planning reforms that are coming out, all the way through to shadow treasury team. You know, Stuart has a lot of excellent relationships. Everyone, I would say that he was a former chief whip, so you know, it scares them into doing it. No, I'm joking. So yeah, I think having those relationships are crucial, and actually taking that time now. And it was a point that was made earlier, and I should disclose actually that I'm the president of my local RBL branch. I should have said that at the start. But I think actually those relationships and having those difficult conversations behind the scenes, not publicly, is how the Conservative Party really build now. So the whole purpose of these roundtables is a moment of reflection, but also a moment of opportunity to go forward. And actually, we may not agree on everything, but actually we can understand where you're coming from and what the actual issues are, and pick those up and try and challenge. And I think that's the key to those relationships over the longer term, and making sure that hopefully when we're in government in a few years' time, those relationships continue, and hopefully I'll be on this brief because I love it.
Definitely, and I think that you know, RBL, we supported 25,000 people last year through our casework services. We supported, I think, almost 1,500 veterans through war pension claims. So we've got a really good idea about what is and isn't working for our community at the moment, and that is mirrored across the sector with case studies, lived experience, understanding of on-the-ground policy that we want to share.
Absolutely. Now, just come back on one other thing. I think you mentioned the pandemic, Liv has mentioned. I think the whole cultural outlook on the importance of volunteering has changed fundamentally after the pandemic in a good way. And I look at what happened in my community in Bexley, and I wasn't an MP at that point, but, out delivering the food parcels, the boxes, looking after people, the importance of tackling isolation and all these other issues. I think it's so vital. And I just think this is an open opportunity time to build on that and not forget about that importance. So those challenging areas where people are feeling frustrated with government, feeling left behind, actually, how do we build that kind of broader community aspect and vision in those communities is the big challenge that the Conservative Party is going to have over the next 4 or 5 years.
Hannah, the whole session today is about the relationship between civil society and Conservatives. How important is it?
Well, it's vital. It's essential if you want to influence policy. So many things come down to relationships, which I've talked about before. And we are regulated, so we have to make sure that we are working cross-party. So obviously when a party's in government, you need to focus a bit more on that party, but you have to keep the relationship going because you don't live in a one-party state. And in my 20 years in the charity sector, at different points, I've had to work much more closely with the Lib Dems, with the Green Party, with UKIP at times, because we have to make sure that we're engaging with people who will have the power and influence. So it's pointless for us just to talk to one group.
I'm glad you said that, because that tees up my follow-up question, which is how optimistic do you feel then that the relationship is either in a good place already or could be in a good place?
It's great to hear from Stuart and Louis today. It feels like they're in a different place. To be frank, I work for the Royal British Legion. It's often more easy for us to get a meeting with the Conservative Party than it was when I used to work for Age UK, when I used to work for a child trafficking charity. There are issues that make it easier to engage with the Conservative Party. So I think the more the Conservative Party can do to engage with those organisations and causes that it doesn't naturally have an affinity with, then that could be a positive.
I'd just like to add to that in terms coming from a grassroots charity organisation, small, who probably won't be well known to Conservative Party members. I think the onus should be on the Conservative Party to reach out to those grassroots organisations and find out what's happening on the ground. So you can't just pledge allegiance to organisations that you already knew of. You need to broaden the scope, widen the net in terms of who you're speaking to, because there are matters that are arising that won't be on the radar of the serving government or the opposition until they become major problems, where, to your point about prevention, solving things before they become bigger issues is also a good way to go.
Yeah, I think there's a really good example of some of the work we're doing already on that, where previously we may not have gone anywhere near it in years gone by, and that actually is some of the issues that happen in inner cities which don't really have a conservative footprint, whether that's councillor or MP. So one of the charities that I'm proud to have worked with for a number of years is the Mizzen Foundation. They do a lot of excellent positive engagement in schools around knife crime after the tragic killing of Jimmy, their son. So we're kind of doing work like that naturally because, again, we've got relationships locally, but actually on the sports side, seeing the power of sport, particularly in inner cities. You know, I'm from South East London, and actually looking at how some of these amazing community groups are working in estates and, you know, in really challenging areas where children are vulnerable to gangs and being involved with crime quite early. And actually, how do we keep them on the right path? How do we make sure that there is whatever replaces NCS, actually that's an option, or whether it's sport, football, basketball, whatever it is. And I think that's the work that, because I'm passionate about this area and passionate about sport, as Stuart is, I think we've got a lot of opportunities to build those relationships.
We're naturally targeting a lot of questions at you, Louis. It's the nature of it.
That's why Stuart done the speech.
Exactly. We've had the same question come up 2 or 3 times actually, which is around the civil society covenant, where we'll obviously get some more detail, I think, really quite soon. But what's your thinking on that at the moment? Is it something that you are, obviously depends on the details, but that you would want to then maintain and keep if you were to come back into power?
To be brutally honest, I think it's too early to say. I think having a covenant and making a lot of noise about a covenant is one thing. Actually doing damaging policies like the national insurance hike is another. So I think it's all well and good having a covenant and how great and you want to do this for charities, but actually how do you unlock and how do you tackle the issues? I think often politics go for the soundbite, go for the headline, but actually how do you get into the weeds? What are these issues? So I think we need to see what it looks like, how it works. As Stuart said, we won't oppose for the sake of opposing. We want to be constructive, but we need to see the detail.
Ruth, I'm going to come to you. I know you've already said that you know, you're not a spokesperson for civil society, and so this might be a little bit unfair. But again, a couple of questions coming through on a similar theme, which is around the fact that most charities are really small, and therefore, in terms of the ability to engage with things like roundtables, that's just really hard. There isn't the bandwidth, there isn't the personnel, and there are some charities, and Hannah touched on this earlier, that perhaps don't have a respectful relationship with policymakers, and indeed some charities that you would find really just quite abhorrent. So when we talk about the sector and civil society, how do we kind of manage our own house, I suppose, and make sure that we, A, ensure that everyone behaves in the right way, but B, provide a route in for voice for those smaller charities that provide incredible insight, but say, don't necessarily have the bandwidth?
Complex
Told you it was hard.
question. Listening and sorting out I mean, I think, you know, we know that civil society is broad and diverse, and sometimes I think it's really unhelpful when we talk about the sector, because it encompasses so many sizes, so many challenges, so many issues, that just putting civil society together as one homogenous group, I think, is sometimes unhelpful. Sometimes I think that plays against smaller charities, and we need to really listen. You know, it's about listening on the ground often, and I think Conservative MPs are really well placed to go out and listen to their constituencies, to work with smaller charities, and then to amplify that up. There will always be charities that are perhaps straying outside their lane, to use your language, and the regulator needs to be able to look at that. But I think challenging that privately, as we've discussed, building those relationships, understanding why that's happening, and how, because often that kind of those kind of issues are arising because people don't feel they're listened to, they don't feel their issues, their voice is being heard. So really coming back to that listening and that relationship and local work at a fundamental level, I think, is really critical.
Brilliant, thank you. That was a hard question and a great answer. Well done. Right, we are hurtling towards the end, so I'm going to ask each panelist maybe to give one final thought that they would like our audience to take away, and maybe once they are eating their croissants, ask them some more about. Both Hannah and Seb are looking at me as if, am I going first? Am I going first? Let's say we're going to start in the middle. We're going to start in the middle with Juro.
I'm happy to chime in. I think my final thought would probably be to the Conservative Party. So, it's about using your ability to convene. Like, you have major Conservative donors high net worth individuals, philanthropists within the Conservative Party, and that don't and give money to the Conservative Party, how can you use your convening power to bring them together to start championing causes that will better civil society? So yes, Labour's in government at the moment, and we're talking about, how can you be a good opposing party, but what can you do even while you're not in government? How can you use that convening power to really push things forward? And Labour can learn from it, but if you are looking to come back into office, that will really put you in good stead in terms of really walking the walk and talking the talk.
Brilliant, thank you. Ruth?
So one of the things we haven't touched on is the impact of local government reorganisation and increased devolution, the creation of new combined authorities, which I think are going to have a huge impact on the charity sector. So thinking about how locally, regionally and nationally the Conservative Party can work with charities, with the sector, perhaps to kind of mitigate some of that turbulence that will come, but also understand what that will look like for the charity sector, both in terms of their funding and their influence and the services they can deliver on the ground.
Okay, good thought. Hannah?
I think, there's a role for the charity sector to organise itself. We can work in coalitions. We can make it easier to put our arguments and our case studies forward. As Stuart said, you don't have the offices, that we can help you do some of that work. And I think if we can use this next policy renewal phase to reset the relationship with the sector, that would be great for everyone.
Excellent. Seb?
I think I'd come back to the point about the fact that this is a unique moment for the reset that we've kind of talked about, that yes, the Conservative Party, is out of power, had a very bad election defeat, and the general centre-right is having to go back to a lot of first principles in terms of thinking about what it stands for, and its engagement with all different parts of society. And that gives a great opportunity, both through the kind of formal policy review, but also through MPs and councillors and mayors and other parts of the kind of wider centre-right movement to engage them afresh. And I think for those in civil society, I would say come at it with an open mind, that there'll be people who want to relitigate everything that happened over the past 14 years, which I don't think is broadly helpful for anyone, but realize this is a new moment where you can start things afresh and come with new ideas and get a fair hearing as well.
Excellent, thank you. And Lou, I've deliberately left you to the end.
Well, yeah, just to say thank you again for everyone coming this morning. I'll be hanging around for a while, and we are in listening mode. So very much engaging. Please engage with us as much as possible. Like I said, we may not agree on everything, but we're keen and passionate as a team, and fully behind Kemi's idea of this kind of policy work. This is an opportunity for the sector and for us to listen, to engage, and try and build really strong kind of policy ideas to unlock all the challenges, or most of the challenges, that the broader sector is facing.
Thank you, and thank you to all of you for what I think, within an hour, we've covered a lot of ground. It's been candid and open, and we've not ducked things, but encouraging too. It feels like there's a real opportunity here to grasp, and I hope that we can. And I hope that all of you can too. And as I said at the very start, that this is a conversation that continues rather than an event which closes and we never speak of again. Do stick around. As I said at the start, we've got pastries at the back, coffee and tea still to go. So stay around for a chat. I said that this is the final part of our trilogy, so it draws a line under what has been a very effective series for PB and civil society. But like all good franchises, they eventually get rebooted. And all we're waiting for is the money men to get behind it. And I'm sure we'll be back and be convening you all again for more events in the future. So thank you again for coming. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Stuart. And go enjoy your day.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Cheers. Thank you very much.